Okay, there we go. Okay. All right, so here we are. So intelligence is doing the right thing at the right time, as defined back when people were trying to figure out which animals were more intelligent than each other, right? And I love this definition, not only because it was the first one I learned as an undergraduate in Chicago, but also because it's a form of computation. And you'll see me use that later in the talk. But oops, now I have to accept that or else I can't go forward. Okay, here we go. Get back to the slides. There we go. Okay. And as we mentioned yesterday, I prefer the definition. There are many definitions, but I like to use the definition of agents where there any vector of change. For example, chemical agents are the ones that cause a reaction. But the things that people really care about are not so much intelligence and agents. I think the main things that we will care about that's like important to us is who is responsible for their actions, and also who are those people responsible for, okay? And notice I've highlighted here that these are done by a society. So different societies have different ideas about how old you have to be to consent to sex or to fight in the military, or all kinds of different, who can own what gender you have to be. Sometimes people think that you're not an adult until your father dies, right? So these are things that have traditionally not only been defined by a society, but I would argue define a society. So this is a slightly different take on ethics, although maybe Lynette will now tell me this was also Locke, I don't know. But I would argue that ethics is determined by and determines a society. It's all of the rules that you use for holding your society together. And notice this is, I put here what Lynette just told us is the second definition of fairness, a constantly renegotiated set of equilibrium. We keep striving for more inclusion and basically more security, more strength for our society. All right. By this definition, law is a part of ethics. All right. So artificial intelligence, once you've got all this, then it's really easy. Artificial intelligence is just the subset of the intelligence stuff that somebody built deliberately. And normally in most of human societies, we consider the deliberate action by an adult is the responsibility of that human adult. Okay. And so that's where my line on AI ethics being human-centered comes from. All right, so, but that's not what we're talking about. We're here to talk about transparency. And before I talk about transparency, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this responsibility notion I've been leaning so hard on. Okay, so responsibility is a property of moral agents it is the property that moral agents of society assign to each other in order to uphold that society, okay? And so it implies a peer relationship, as does trust. We were just talking about this too. So trust is a relationship between peers where we allow a trustee not to be micromanaged, right? And when we say allow here, we can see this also in non-human primates, right? Like what is it, why people are always saying, why do the subordinates allow the dominants to prevent them from having access to the females or whatever? This is with males, obviously. Yeah, let me not entirely, obviously. Anyway, and then people turned on their head and they thought, oh, maybe what's really going on is that the dominants are failing to invest that much effort to fully chase away the subordinates because they do get some access to good things, including security, by hanging around with the truth. So when you get into a situation where you need ethics is when you can't actually entirely control the society. It's actually, that's what the pureness is about. It's about that this is the best way to be able to be secure yourself. It's not just about what is right or whatever. And certainly the monkeys aren't sitting around discussing ancient texts. They're just saying that, though they're not saying, they've evolved to be in these contexts where they put enough effort in to try to maintain the status that they can achieve, but also they don't want to waste too much time chasing the others away. And that turns out to be good for their security. Anyway, what this implies is that we should not trust powerful agencies, but rather construct systems to hold them accountable, which of course it turns out is Locke. I didn't know that. Okay, accountability is a society's capacity to trace that responsibility. And now we get to transparency. It's the means by which accountability is implemented. I say never an end to itself, but a lot of computer scientists, we just think, oh, I'll be transparent, all right? But the idea is, how do you know how much transparency is enough? So a lot of computer scientists used to think it was transparent if you open sourced your software. So, and it took us a while to figure out that wasn't either necessary nor sufficient. right? So the medical industry is much better regulated, pharmaceuticals much better regulated, not perfectly, but better than the software industry, right? And it has 10 times as much IP. It's not that it open sources everything to everyone. It has trusted people that come in and audit it. And similarly, if you do dump 10 million lines of code on the internet, nobody understands that. It depends how you wrote it. So transparency takes more effort than that. You actually have to make sure that you can demonstrate that you have been behaving accountably. And to be motivated to do that, you have to have somebody that's applying enforcement. And so this is where the question of self and other governance comes in. Okay, so transparency is the information pathways through which understanding, including accountability, can be established. Okay, this is my claim, this is a new slide, and responsibility enforced. And then just as a line, this has been a remarkably clean meeting, so I probably don't need to talk too much about this, but you cannot enforce directly against the system, the technology. And so, well, I forgot I put this in here. This is a slightly older paper where I was talking about whether or not AI should be treated as a moral patient, dealing with the anthropomorphism issues. But if you think of a behavioral context where there's more than one thing you can possibly do. So an individual has multiple choices and one is considered by a society to be the more socially beneficial, all right? So I think that is the time when you start talking about moral actions. And so a lot of people have said, but of course, AI is a moral agent because it takes moral actions, right? And that's true by this definition. So if you say, easily you could have a robot that could recognize there's more than one context, and one is the one that benefits society. So we could build that, all right? But my argument here is that even though there is these are moral actions, they have impact on the society, that doesn't imply that the agent that takes them is necessarily a moral agent within the context of society. So I already mentioned monkeys behave also as if there's individuals who are responsible for their actions. They punish those, even superordinates. They can mob against superordinates if they think that the superordinate is being unfair, like it's beating up a subordinate too much. But also within your own household, you might treat a pet as if it's a moral agent. You might say you knew better than to poo in the middle of the floor or something. And the pet may be treating you like a moral agent, say you knew better than to come home that late, right? And you're sanctioning each other, right? So you're treating each other as moral agents within the context of your household. But within the context of society, nobody's going to accept that your dog is responsible for what your dog does. Not entirely, right? You are responsible, you are the moral and legal agent of a Western society. Okay, so this comes back to the socially sanctioned thing. So we cannot sanction against AI, right? Law and justice are more about dissuasion than recompense. Recompense is nice when you can get it, but we really want to make sure that bad things don't keep happening. And so the phenomenological impact of social sanctions on AI is just in no way equivalent to its impact on humans, right? I was going to say Drosophila, I'll try to stop being such a biologist. Even fruit flies, if they've been separated for a while, then when they get back together, they start fighting over status, right? Their fruit flies are more violent, right? We have that understanding of, when we come back, when we've been away for a long time, of that conflict. We have more phenomenological in common with fruit flies than we will ever have with designed artifacts. And people have trouble getting that through their heads because of the automatic anthropomorphism that was being discussed yesterday. For example, the fact that they're using natural language, but it just isn't the same. No system is going to care about the fact that it's been turned off or put in the closet or anything else. You can put a number in the system so that when that number goes high, it says, oh, I don't like this, right? But it's not the kind of systemic aversion that any social animal feels to isolation because of evolution is trying to stop us from doing something stupid, which is getting eaten by big bears or something, right? That's systemic. When you build AI, you don't do that. Safe AI is modular, and we'll talk about this later. Some people talk about end-to-end, they also talk about whole brain uploading. I don't think that that's a very good way to engineer systems. There's limits to how much you can do that way. But also, if we're talking about a regulatable system, then we need modularity. And I'm going to give an example. That is the one slide I did insert into this last night that was totally new because in response to Son of Octor. But I just want to point out that AI, if we made it a legal agent, it would be the ultimate shell company. That we have a paper about this. And in the paper, going back to this conversation about, is this just AI or is this governance in general? In the paper, we point out that this process of trying to recognize AI as a legal person is part of the process we've seen since the end of the Cold War of allowing the use of legal personality, right? So it's sort of part of the corruption of the system since the 90s. All right, so digital systems are easy to make transparent. Now, I loved the EU white paper by and large, but there was at least two things that were really incomprehensible to me why they believed. One was that risk-based enforcement was somehow had to do with binary, like binary status. And the other was that AI is necessarily opaque. They kept saying that, like, no, it's not. And then I was on some panel with a guy that was the head of Google for Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. And he's like, oh, we love the EU white paper, especially these two parts. And I was like, oh, now I know where those two parts came from. Anyway, when we audit, we don't audit micro details, right? Like if you're auditing a bank, you don't say, explain to me what the synapses are doing in the bankers, okay? We audit what the humans, because they're the peers, they're the ones we can enforce against, what the humans did when they built and they trained and they tested and deployed the system, right? So good maintainable systems engineering of software, which AI is almost always software, there's some hardware components, but we're talking about software right now. When you architect the system, there's going to be design, you need to document that, what are the components? You get these crazy people from, what is it, Future of Life, you know, so talking about like, what if your chess program shoots you because you turn it off overnight when it wanted to learn? It's like, okay, first of all, no programmer ever turns off their computer at night. What are they talking about? We want the systems to learn at night. But secondly, no programmer puts a gun on a chess program. What are you talking about there, right? So there is an architecture to the system. You keep track of what the components are and where they came from, where the software was. How do you, Sita Girza has done this great paper with her partner, whose name I've just forgotten, about the agile turn in software and how that has been a way of breaking responsibility. And we just saw that by Microsoft and everybody who uses their systems, including a lot of governments, with the solar flare thing. Solar winds. But anyway, you need to know, because that, I don't know if you know, that was like 2 companies back in the chain of libraries. It wasn't really SolarWind that had the direct hack, but they were using software that somebody else had produced, and that was where the injection happened. Okay, so the provenance of the software and the data libraries. Again, you can do certain kinds of attacks. I don't know if they're overrated by assault through data libraries, but more importantly, going back to sort of the bias things, you need to know, did you source appropriate data? Where did it come from? Could anyone have injected things? All right, we keep track of this stuff. You know, if you were making any other manufactured product, of course you would be keeping track of who were the people that you sourced your components from. Can you trust them? You know, all those kinds of things. Are they using ethical practices? It's normal. It's just that people haven't been seeing software as a manufactured artifact, but it is. And incidentally, for those of you who can legislate, it would be nice, this is ambiguous in the EU law right now. We need to make it clear that even if software provides a service, it is a product that provides a service. Okay, so please do clarify this. Right now it's ambiguous. But I'm going to assert it is a manufactured product and we should just be using normal liability to that. Okay, so then also you secure all the stuff that you do yourself. So you're actually building of things. And this is normal. This has been normal for about 30 years. You know, we've been improving, it's called DevOps. We've been improving DevOps and software since the 80s and 90s. In fact, actually through the 70s, you can read Frederick Brooks' book from the 70s about how to do better DevOps, although it wasn't called that then. But for some reason, AI companies are not doing this, or if they are doing it, they're hiding it from the auditors, right? They're pretending not to do it. Anyway, of course you should do this. Maybe it's because AI companies have a lot of psychologists in them, or maybe they believe their own hype and they're anthropomorphizing and they say, oh, you don't keep logs on children. So anyway, for machine learning, you also need to log, as I mentioned, data libraries and also the parameters. It's unbelievable how many people throw away their parameters and then can't replicate their own products. It's really weird. And then, so I've just slightly shifted this over to the kinds of things that given it's easily transparent, we should be able to look up. And then also, besides all those parts of the systems engineering, you should have already determined what tests you needed to pass and be able to show what those tests were and how the passing happened during, and then after release, if you have, you should have things that are making sure things are still performing well, whether or not you have machine learning. And if you think all this stuff is impossible, remember that every single time the driverless car has been in an accident, we've had like front page news about what went wrong within like 2 days, right? Why? Because the automotive industry is reasonably well regulated. Okay, so you can have people claiming, oh, it's impossible, AI is opaque, we just have to accept that so we get better performance on the main stage of like an O'Reilly event. This happened to be in New York City, right? Giant, stadium. You go downstairs where all the people that are teaching, their courses to people. And there's all these people providing the exact tools the guys upstairs are saying are impossible. They're providing them to the automotive industry, the medical industry, the insurance industry, because those industries have to have those tools. You can do it. All right. If you're good with digital technology, transparency should be easy. And here's another thing that Lynette stole. Same example, but it's not surprising that 2 people talk about this. In fact, I think it was talked about yesterday. This is me with 2 of those 4 people. Last time I was in Seattle. But of course, that's not the only Google failure of transparency that I worry about personally. I was also on this, I won't say the rude word for what that was, or there's multiple rude words. Okay, anyway, it's called the Advanced Technology, ATEC, Advanced Technology External Advisory Council. That's right, there we go. And it was also shut down partly by internal conflict about who they didn't see that they wanted this much diversity on their external advisory council. Okay, so then let's get back to those actual limits of transparency I talked to you about. The first one is physical. People keep forgetting that there's physical things that are problems, right? I mentioned before that intelligence is computation. It's not an abstraction. It's not perfect. It's not eternal, and it's not instantaneous. It takes time, space, and energy. Finding the right thing to do at the right time. One way you could think about it is search. You think, oh no, I learn, I don't search. Well, learning is a search for parameters. Okay, so you trust me, you search. And the cost of search is like the number of things that you could do raised to how many things you're going to do, how many steps you get to take. And I know that's a little abstract. So here's an example. If you had a robot that had 100 things it could do, and it needed to get to Paris or something, then if it happens that one of the things that it's been programmed to do is get to Paris and it doesn't know that, then in the worst case, there's 100 things that would have to try to get to Paris. If it happens that it has to turn left, then go to Paris, there's already 10,000 possible plans, 100 things you could try, followed by another 100 things. And we all know that we do a lot more than 2 things in a day. So this is amazingly, the combinatorial explosion is impossible to get your head around. One of the great ways, and you're not going to believe this, but it's okay. The same guy who figured out information theory, he figured out this. The number of 35 move games of chess, so not moving the rook back and forth forever, is greater than the numbers of atoms in the universe, okay? And we all know by now that chess is simpler than Go, and Go is simpler than life, okay? So we are never going to have omniscience. That's not a real threat. That particular version of the singularity is not sensible. Superintelligence we already have, but not omniscience. That's not a problem. So how is it that humans are even as smart as we are? Because one thing you can do is you have 2 computers that then you can spend half the time, but the same amount of energy, and you need twice as much space, right? Quantum saves space some of the time. So you can run concurrently in the same computer, multiple things, but it seems to be worse than the same amount of energy so far. I'm not, just random quantum expert, but I've been giving this slide for a while and no one has well, actually you'll get one person contradict anything. But anyway, all the informed people are going, it looks right now like if quantum is ever brought on board, unless we achieve true energy independence, which again, some transhumanists believe is around the corner, it's only going to be used by like nation states and in weaponized contexts. It's too expensive to use for anything seriously otherwise. Okay. So human intelligence, including AI, which I would say is a part of our society's intelligence, is based on millennia of concurrent parallel search. That's how we handle this change. And this is part of that globalization process people were talking about. We have approximately 8 billion people coming more and more online, right? Getting better nutrition, better educations, and better connection to each other through ICT. And that, I would say, is much more of the change in the pace of change than just AI itself. I think mobile phones are a lot bigger part of that. So one of the consequences of this, the consequence that AI, when we train it with machine learning based on what we already know, is that we get the same implicit biases. I would rather call them stereotypes that come out of the data. And so this is a paper in 2017. I'm not going to go into details. Again, it's pretty well known at this stage. It was in Science, but the basic thing is that the same implicit biases that psychologists had been demonstrating using reaction times about what was easier to pair, which concepts were easier to pair. If you just look at the word embeddings, which are basically giant spreadsheets where you just count like how similar of a context do these words occur in, you get the same result. And it turned out, but again, speaking of cancel culture, I had no idea. The results of the implicit bias that the psychologists had done were some of the biggest effects. You see that D? It means that it was more than one standard deviation away, right? How much easier it was to pair female names with family words and male names with career words than the other way around. More than one standard deviation. Okay, so absolutely not a controversial result. Oh, but it was, because people didn't like the result and because it didn't correlate with our explicit biases, which that's the difference between implicit and explicit. Okay, we get this paper done. Arvind Narayanan, maybe it's just because he's a genius of fairness and transparent AI. He's been going to the conference for years. I still haven't attended yet. But also he was up for tenure that year. He was kind of freaked out about how strong this was. So he had the absolute genius idea of now that we've got the word embeddings, we've captured implicit bias in our AI, let's see how it relates to the real world. Okay, so this is one of two measures we took. It's the US labor statistics. And so the y-axis there is those evil, sexist, showing implicit bias word embeddings. And the x-axis and the dots are the names of jobs. And the x-axis is the actual, according to US labor statistics, the proportion of people in those jobs that are women.